June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach. The English Channel churned with gray water and steel. Dawn crept over the horizon, revealing an armada stretching farther than the eye could see. Landing craft rolled on the waves like scattered toys, each packed with young men bracing for the impossible. It was 5:30 hours when the first outlines of the French coast appeared. Jagged cliffs, concrete casemates, and shadowed openings carved deep into the rock. Hitler's Atlantic Wall stood ahead, a chain of fortresses built to stop the world's strongest armies. Through sea spray and gunfire, American engineers gripped their gear, satchel charges, wire cutters, Bangalore torpedoes, tools meant not for defense but for demolition. Their task was clear and fatal: open the beach for the rest to follow. As the ramps dropped, machine gun fire shredded the surf. Men vanished under waves. Others crawled forward, dragging explosives through blood and sand. Amid the chaos, they measured, cut, and blasted. Each explosion tore a small wound in the German line. They were not fighting for territory yet. They were fighting the wall itself, one bunker at a time. By the summer of 1942, Adolf Hitler had accepted a grim reality. His dream of invading Britain was gone, and the war's tide was turning. The Wehrmacht still held most of Western Europe, but the Führer's mind was already fixed on defense. The next battle, he believed, would come from the sea. He ordered the creation of an unbreakable line of fortifications stretching from the icy fjords of Norway to the warm beaches of southern France. More than 2,000 miles of reinforced coastline. It would be called the Atlantic Wall, and it was to stand as Europe's final shield against the Allies. Behind this vision stood Organisation Todt, the Nazi construction corps responsible for autobahns and fortresses. Thousands of engineers, soldiers, and forced laborers, many from occupied France and Eastern Europe, worked around the clock, pouring millions of tons of concrete and embedding steel into the coastline. Each bunker, each casemate, was unique, tailored to terrain, designed for interlocking fields of fire, and bristling with machine guns and artillery pieces scavenged from across the continent. At key points like Cherbourg, Calais, and Normandy, the Germans built enormous concrete monsters, casemates housing 155mm and 210mm guns capable of shredding ships before they touched shore. Anti-tank walls, minefields, trenches, and barbed wire covered every possible landing zone. By 1943, propaganda films hailed the Atlantic Wall as impenetrable, a fortress Europe that would crush any invader before he even landed. But across the Channel, American planners were already studying how to destroy it. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and Navy Seabees, working with British and Canadian counterparts, began gathering intelligence from captured French coastlines and resistance reports. Aerial reconnaissance photographed bunker complexes down to the angle of each gun barrel. Engineers pored over blueprints and soil studies, analyzing how to breach concrete thicker than any civilian structure ever built. In Washington and London, war planners understood the stakes. No landing, no matter how large, could succeed unless engineers could break through obstacles and silence German bunkers. This would not be a battle of tanks or planes. It would be a contest of construction versus destruction, of German concrete against American ingenuity. Through 1943, while German soldiers reinforced cliffs and dunes, American minds raced to design answers. Demolition torpedoes, amphibious tanks, floating causeways, and prefabricated piers. The U.S. military called it engineering for invasion. Meanwhile, German Commander Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, now overseeing the Atlantic defenses, toured the coast with cold precision. He ordered more mines, more obstacles, more bunkers, convinced that the first 24 hours of an invasion would decide the war. If the Allies were not thrown back into the sea on day one, he warned, Germany would lose Europe. So the Germans worked feverishly, planting over 6 million mines and covering beaches with steel hedgehogs, logs, and underwater traps designed to rip apart landing craft. Rommel boasted that any invader would die on the beaches. But what the Germans could not foresee was that the men destined to face this wall were not only soldiers, they were builders. The same American engineers who had erected bridges, airfields, and bases across continents were now preparing for the most complex demolition in history. From the sands of North Africa to the cliffs of England, they trained to dismantle the Atlantic Wall before it could even react. learning every weakness, rehearsing every explosion. And as winter turned to spring in 1944, the question was no longer if the wall could be cracked. It was when and where. By early 1944, the Allied plan to invade Western Europe had matured into one of the most complex operations in military history. The code name was Operation Overlord, and its success rested not only on courage or numbers, but on engineering. Every mile of the French coast was charted, every tide and current recorded, and every German fortification analyzed. For the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Navy Seabees, this was a new kind of warfare. They were not preparing to build, they were preparing to unbuild. Their objective was to dismantle an entire defense system under fire, in real time, while the enemy still held the ground. In England, vast training camps and mock beaches were constructed to simulate German defenses. Engineers rehearsed demolitions on life-size replicas of bunkers and seawalls. They practiced laying and removing mines, setting explosive charges in high wind and surf, and clearing steel obstacles with timed detonations. Every movement was choreographed down to seconds because on invasion day, delay meant death. At the same time, American and British scientists raced to solve the engineering riddles that the Atlantic Wall presented. Concrete several meters thick could not be penetrated by ordinary explosives. Engineers experimented with shaped charges and Bangalore torpedoes, tubes packed with explosives that could be pushed under wire or obstacles and detonated to clear paths through minefields. These innovations were tested relentlessly in the English countryside, far from the public eye. Behind the frontline engineers stood a chain of logistical miracles. The U.S. had created entire floating harbors, mulberry ports, to unload supplies directly onto beaches once the coast was taken. These prefabricated structures were shipped across the channel in pieces, assembled at sea, and anchored off Normandy within days of D-Day. The same engineering mind that built America's highways and bridges now served the greatest amphibious operation ever attempted. Every element of the invasion had an engineering solution. Amphibious tanks, the D.D. Shermans, were fitted with flotation skirts and propellers. Landing ship, tanks, LSTs, were redesigned to deliver vehicles directly onto beaches. Bulldozers were armored to clear wreckage and carve paths through sand under machine gun fire. Yet, even with this preparation, no one underestimated the wall. Intelligence from the French resistance and aerial photos revealed rows of concrete casemates, anti-tank ditches, and heavy artillery hidden behind disguised bunkers. The Germans had even installed dummy obstacles to lure demolition teams into minefields. Still, American confidence grew. Each new design, each test explosion, brought them closer to the solution. To the engineers of the U.S. Army, the Atlantic Wall was not an invincible fortress. It was a complex machine, and like any machine, it could be taken apart. In March 1944, General Dwight D. Eisenhower approved the final invasion timetable. The engineer's role was defined in chillingly simple terms: clear and open the beach for assault. They would land with the first waves, ahead of tanks and heavy weapons, under direct fire, to cut lanes through wire and mines. Each lane had to be at least 50 feet wide, enough for infantry and vehicles to pass through before the Germans regrouped. The planners knew many would not return. Survival rates for the first waves were expected to be low. But without them, the invasion would fail before it began. So they trained harder. In May 1944, as the final briefings echoed through British camps, engineers loaded their explosives, testing fuses and waterproof bags one last time. They painted identification stripes on helmets and memorized every obstacle on the beach diagrams pinned to their tents. The Atlantic Wall was waiting. Its concrete bunkers faced the sea like silent predators, their guns fixed on the horizon. But across that gray channel, the Americans were coming. Not just with weapons, but with blueprints, wire cutters, and courage drawn from calculation. They had learned how the wall was built. Now they would show how it could be destroyed. To most soldiers, the Atlantic Wall looked like a graveyard waiting to happen. To the American engineers, it was a problem to be solved. One that demanded invention under pressure, precision under fire, and nerves of steel. Every part of the invasion's engineering assault had been designed with a single goal: defeat German concrete. The Germans had built their bunkers with an almost fanatical obsession for durability. Reinforced with layers of steel and concrete up to 10 feet thick, many casemates could withstand direct hits from naval guns. Air attacks often left them scarred but operational. Each fortification was built to anchor a defensive network, interlocking fields of fire overlapping to cover every inch of beach. To reach them meant crossing mined sand, open water, and steel obstacles under constant machine gun bursts. The U.S. response came through a combination of mechanical innovation and human improvisation. The first answer was mobility, amphibious vehicles. The D.D. Sherman tanks, short for duplex drive, could swim ashore, bringing firepower directly onto the beaches. Not all survived the rough seas at Omaha, but those that did gave covering fire to engineers crawling below. Then came the Hobart's Funnies, British-designed but American-adapted engineering vehicles. Flail tanks that whipped rotating chains to clear mines, bulldozers fitted with armor plates to push debris and fill craters, and demolition tanks that fired explosive charges directly into bunker embrasures. Though some of these designs were more heavily used by British units, their principles were studied and implemented across the Allied front. But machines alone couldn't win. The key lay in combat engineers on foot, often carrying over 40 pounds of explosives and tools. They worked in small demolition teams called gap assault units. Each man had a specific task, one to probe for mines, one to lay satchel charges, one to ignite detonators. Coordination meant survival. A vital weapon in their arsenal was the Bangalore torpedo, a metal tube filled with high explosive that could be pushed under wire or obstacles. When detonated, it ripped open a path through barbed wire and mines, clearing the way for infantry. Used first in World War I, it was refined for Normandy, longer, stronger, easier to assemble under fire. They also carried Composition C2, a plastic explosive that could be molded by hand against concrete. Engineers learned to shape it around cracks and seams, targeting bunker weaknesses where structural stress was highest. It was science applied in seconds, often while bullets struck sand inches away. Naval fire was the engineer's unseen ally. Offshore, U.S. destroyers moved dangerously close to the beaches, firing point-blank at bunker apertures to suppress gunners while demolition teams advanced. On Omaha, some ships came within 800 yards, closer than naval doctrine ever allowed. The Atlantic Wall's strength met the combined precision of naval gunnery and field engineering. Every success was measured in yards, a single breach, a cleared path, a silenced gun. The Germans had counted on their fortifications to delay an enemy for days. American engineers reduced those delays to hours. By noon on D-Day, small craters dotted the beaches where once stood barbed wire and tank traps. Each hole was proof of a decision made under fire, a calculation that concrete could never think faster than men could act. But beyond the tactical brilliance, there was another story unfolding. One not written in blueprints, but in sweat, courage, and raw human resolve. For the American engineers who stormed the beaches that June morning, the Atlantic Wall wasn't just a line of concrete. It was a living thing, growling through machine gun bursts, spitting fire from invisible openings, echoing across the surf like thunder trapped in stone. They had studied blueprints, memorized obstacle diagrams, drilled every motion. But none of it could prepare them for the reality that greeted them at Omaha and Utah. The sand trembled under bombardment. The air was filled with the smell of salt, smoke, and cordite. Bodies floated in the tide. Orders vanished under the roar of battle. Still, small groups of engineers pressed forward. They moved low, dragging long poles with detonator caps, their uniforms heavy with seawater. Some carried canvas satchels packed with explosives. Others pushed Bangalore torpedoes through the sand, each section connecting to the next like a deadly steel snake. When one man fell, another crawled forward to finish the circuit. It was deliberate, brutal work, a race between courage and death. Those who survived long enough to light a fuse had only seconds to take cover before an eruption of sand and smoke tore a lane through the defenses. Then, without hesitation, they rose and moved again, creating a path for the next wave. Behind them came the infantry, weary, soaked, disoriented, but following trails marked by white tape tied by engineers under fire. Those thin strips of cloth were lifelines through chaos, guiding thousands toward the cliffs and out of the kill zone. Every bunker breached came at a cost. Some engineers were never found, their remains buried beneath collapsed casemates they had destroyed. Others returned dazed but alive, ears ringing, faces blackened by powder burns. Many had fought less as soldiers and more as craftsmen, improvising survival one explosion at a time. And yet, their determination shocked even the Germans. From inside their fortifications, Wehrmacht soldiers watched in disbelief as the Americans, pinned down, cut off and bleeding, continued to crawl forward, building bridges, clearing mines, and detonating charges. One German officer later recalled, "They worked like machines, even when the fire was impossible." This persistence broke the psychological barrier the Atlantic Wall was built upon. The fortifications had been meant to terrify, to paralyze any invader with the idea of futility. Instead, the Americans treated fear as another obstacle to dismantle. At Point du Hoc, U.S. Rangers scaled cliffs under fire to silence the guns that threatened both Utah and Omaha beaches. They used ropes, grappling hooks, and ladders, primitive tools against concrete giants. When they reached the top, they found the main guns had been hidden inland, yet they pressed on, locating and destroying them with thermite grenades. It was an act of sheer resolve that stunned both friend and foe. By the afternoon of June 6th, the once invincible Atlantic Wall was scarred and fractured. The German defenders, many convinced the line would hold for days, now found themselves isolated in bunkers surrounded by smoke and rubble. From the outside, the wall was cracking. From the inside, morale was collapsing. And beneath that collapsing wall, the Americans were preparing for the next step. Not just to breach, but to break through. June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach, Normandy. By mid-morning, the channel had turned red. Waves carried broken gear, shattered boats, and the wounded back toward the sea. The first assault waves had been torn apart. German machine guns, firing from bunkers embedded deep in the cliffs, swept the beach from end to end. The wall still stood, intact, roaring, alive. At 8 o'clock hours, the situation looked hopeless. Communications had failed. Radio operators were dead or their sets waterlogged. Smoke blinded both sides. Commanders offshore had little idea who was alive, who was trapped, or who was still moving. And yet, scattered across the sand, the engineers still worked. On the western flank near Dog Green Sector, a handful of men from the 146th Engineer Combat Battalion crawled through craters and bodies, assembling their Bangalore torpedoes by hand. Others knelt in the surf, wiring fuses, counting seconds between explosions. Each detonation cleared a few more feet of wire, a few more mines. Inch by inch, a lane began to form. By 9 o'clock, those narrow paths, barely wide enough for two men, had become arteries of survival. Infantry squads from the 1st and 29th Divisions began pushing through, clinging to whatever cover they could find. Sherman tanks that had survived the rough sea followed behind, their tracks grinding over mines already triggered by engineers' charges. Then came the shift, a moment when destruction turned into momentum. At 10:15, a U.S. destroyer, the USS Satterlee, defied orders and moved dangerously close to the shore, so close that the hull scraped sandbanks beneath the waves. Its 5-inch guns fired point-blank into the mouth of German bunkers overlooking Point du Hoc, shaking the cliffs themselves. Other destroyers, McCook, Carmick, Thompson, followed suit. Each shot cracked open another piece of the Atlantic Wall. The engineers seized that moment. Under the cover of naval bombardment, they surged forward. Satchel charges were planted at the bases of bunkers. Composition C2 was molded like clay around steel embrasures. Fuses burned bright in the smoke. Concrete shattered in violent bursts. German gunners inside screamed as their own walls collapsed around them. By midday, the rhythm of battle changed. The once dominant machine gun fire grew sporadic. Smoke rose from the fortifications that had ruled the coast only hours before. Infantry began to climb the slopes behind the beach, no longer pinned, but advancing. At Utah Beach to the west, the story was similar but faster. Strong currents had pushed American landing craft off course, ironically saving lives by depositing troops in a lightly defended sector. Engineers there worked methodically, clearing mines and obstacles with minimal resistance. Within hours, They had carved multiple lanes through the defenses, opening paths for tanks and supplies. But Omaha was the heart of the storm, and it was the engineers who turned that storm. Their tools had been designed for precision, not chaos. Yet on that day, precision was survival. Every bunker destroyed, every wire cut, every obstacle blown apart became a statement. The wall could bleed. And once that belief took hold, the tide of war began to turn. By early afternoon, reports filtered back to headquarters, gaps open, troops moving inland. Eisenhower's gamble had worked. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's pride, was cracking under the pressure of American courage and ingenuity. But the fight was far from over. Deep inland, more fortifications waited. Interconnected bunkers, tunnels, and gun positions prepared for a final stand. The engineers would have to go after them next, bunker by bunker, yard by yard. By the early afternoon of June 6th, the beaches of Normandy were still burning. The Atlantic Wall had not fallen, but it was bleeding from 1,000 wounds. The sea air carried the mixed scent of salt, smoke, and concrete dust. Engineers, soldiers, and sailors were working together in chaos, every man part of a living machine determined to move forward. At Colleville-sur-Mer, American engineers reached the base of one of the most heavily fortified bluffs on Omaha Beach. Above them, hidden beneath layers of concrete and camouflage, German gunners fired down with deadly precision. The engineers had one advantage: their explosives. Crawling from crater to crater, they placed shaped charges at the base of embrasures, sometimes throwing them by hand into firing ports before diving for cover. Each detonation echoed like thunder trapped in stone. In one sector, survivors of the 299th Engineer Combat Battalion managed to clear a path for tanks by wiring together dozens of small demolition charges into one massive blast. When it fired, the explosion tore a 40-foot gap through barbed wire, mines, and anti-tank traps, enough for a Sherman to surge through. The tank fired directly into a bunker entrance, silencing it after hours of unbroken fire. By 1400 hours, the wall that had seemed immortal began to crumble, not from the outside in, but from within. German positions, once linked by underground corridors, were now isolated. Communications broke down. Officers called for artillery that never arrived. Each lost bunker weakened the next. Still, the resistance was fierce. Some bunkers continued to fight even as the concrete around them burned and cracked. Engineers and infantry had to fight room by room, clearing tunnels, throwing grenades, and flushing out surviving defenders. It was a brutal, intimate kind of combat, fought in smoke and echoing darkness. At Point du Hoc, the 2nd Ranger Battalion, already battered from their cliff assault, discovered that the massive guns they had been sent to destroy were missing. But the engineers accompanying them scoured the surrounding fields and located the artillery hidden in a hedgerow, ready to fire on Utah Beach. Using thermite grenades, they melted the breech mechanisms, rendering the guns useless. It was a small victory, but symbolically immense. By late afternoon, Allied command received confirmation. The first beach exits were secure. Engineers were marking routes for vehicles, clearing rubble, and signaling ships to send in reinforcements. The Atlantic Wall had not been conquered by force of numbers alone. It had been taken apart, one demolition, one breach, one explosion at a time. As dusk fell over Normandy, the German defenders were stunned. For 2 years, propaganda had promised that no invader could cross their line. Now, the beaches they had sworn to protect were littered with their shattered fortifications. In captured diaries and post-war testimonies, many spoke of disbelief, that so many bunkers, designed to withstand everything, had fallen within a single day. From the cliffs, American engineers looked back toward the sea, the horizon filled with ships, landing craft, and smoke. Behind them, the concrete fortresses that had defied the world now lay silent, their guns pointing uselessly toward an empty tide. The wall had broken, and with it, the illusion of Hitler's Fortress Europe. But the victory was not yet complete. The engineers' work had only begun, because what they opened that day was more than a breach in concrete. It was a gateway into occupied Europe, and every road, bridge, and river ahead would demand their skill again. When the smoke cleared over Normandy on the morning of June 7, 1944, the beaches that had once seemed untouchable were under Allied control. Behind the thin dunes, engineers moved methodically through the wreckage, mapping minefields, cutting remaining wires, and detonating delayed explosives. Bulldozers, many armored, some still scarred from battle, pushed twisted metal into piles and carved supply roads from sand to solid ground. What had begun as chaos was becoming order. Within hours, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had transformed a battlefield into a functioning port. Makeshift piers extended into the surf. Causeways supported convoys of trucks carrying ammunition and medical supplies inland. The beachhead was alive. Across the channel, aerial reconnaissance confirmed what the Germans refused to believe. The Atlantic Wall had failed. Despite its millions of tons of concrete and 2 years of construction, it had held the enemy for less than a single day. German commanders along the coast radioed in disbelief. Reports from Cherbourg, Calais, and Le Havre described fortifications intact but cut off, bypassed by advancing infantry and armor. The very structure of the wall, designed to absorb frontal assault, became a weakness once the Americans were behind it. Many bunkers, built to face the sea, had no rear defenses. They were trapped in their own design. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, inspecting the Normandy front days later, found his worst fears realized. The Allies had landed, built up forces, and expanded their foothold before the German counterattack could gather strength. "The enemy's engineers," he remarked to his staff, "are as dangerous as his tanks." For the Americans, the aftermath of D-Day was not rest but relentless labor. The same engineers who had cleared mines under fire now began laying prefabricated roadways, erecting bridges, and building fuel depots. Behind every infantry battalion was a convoy of bulldozers, graders, and trucks carrying steel planks and dynamite. The destruction of one wall had only opened the door to 1,000 new construction sites. They repaired the bombed roads leading inland, converted captured bunkers into command posts, and turned German gun positions into ammunition stores. The beach exits were widened to carry columns of armor and artillery toward the front. Within 3 days, engineers had built the first temporary airstrips, advanced landing grounds, allowing American fighters and reconnaissance planes to operate directly from French soil. For the German defenders, the psychological blow was devastating. Many had believed their positions unassailable, their bunkers indestructible. Now they faced an enemy who had breached their pride, not through overwhelming numbers, but through knowledge, precision, and sheer endurance. Allied intelligence officers began cataloging every fortification captured intact. Engineers studied the construction methods, learning how German concrete resisted certain impacts and failed under others. They found food stores, electric wiring, sleeping bunks, even heating systems, proof that these fortresses had been meant for permanence. Yet permanence had lasted less than 24 hours. By the end of the first week, more than 150,000 Allied troops and 20,000 vehicles had landed in Normandy. The Atlantic Wall, once touted as an iron barrier, was now a series of shattered ruins stretching across the French coast. And as the tide washed back over Omaha Beach, it carried away the last traces of the illusion that concrete could outlast courage. In the weeks that followed the Normandy landings, the battlefield transformed into the largest construction zone in modern history. The Atlantic Wall, once a symbol of German dominance, became raw material for America's advance. U.S. Army engineers and Seabees tore apart bunkers, recycled steel, and used shattered concrete to reinforce roads and bridges heading inland. Everywhere they went, the ruins of the wall marked their path. In St. Laurent, German observation posts became foundations for Allied radar. At Point du Hoc, the craters left by naval shells were turned into storage pits for fuel drums. The tools of war, bulldozers, cranes, and welding torches, worked day and night under the same skies that had witnessed the invasion. By July 1944, the Americans had built over 200 miles of supply roads, established field hospitals, and laid down the Mulberry Harbors, massive floating docks that allowed cargo ships to unload directly onto the beaches. What the Germans had called impregnable now served as the gateway of Allied power into Western Europe. Captured German engineers, interrogated by U.S. intelligence, were astonished by the speed of reconstruction. One officer reportedly remarked, "We thought you would spend weeks clearing the ruins. You built a port instead." It was a moment that summed up the difference between the two sides. Where one built walls, the other built networks. Inside some of the surviving bunkers, engineers found technical blueprints, logs, and construction reports from Organization Todt, the German labor corps responsible for building the fortifications. These documents revealed staggering figures: 17 million cubic meters of concrete, 1.2 million tons of steel, and nearly 300,000 laborers, many of them prisoners or conscripts. The cost of the Atlantic Wall was not just in material, but in human suffering. And yet, all that labor had been undone in a single day by mobility, coordination, and innovation. American field manuals from the Normandy campaign were soon revised to include lessons from the wall. How to identify weak points in reinforced concrete, how to breach minefields under fire, and how to coordinate engineers with armor in confined terrain. These became the templates for operations across France, Belgium, and into Germany itself. As the Allies advanced, engineers continued their war of construction. They built pontoon bridges across the Seine, repaired railway lines through shattered cities, and converted captured German facilities into Allied depots. The experience of breaking through the Atlantic Wall had taught them a powerful truth, that technology was only as strong as the minds that used it. For the Germans, the myth of invincibility was gone. Even Hitler, in his last briefings on the Western Front, acknowledged that the fortifications had failed to stop the tide. The wall had not been a weapon. It had been a monument to fear, and America had dismantled it with skill, courage, and relentless motion. By the time Paris was liberated in August 1944, the story of the Atlantic Wall was already history. The bunkers remained, scattered like bones along the coast, silent reminders of an empire's overconfidence. But for those who had landed under their guns, they were more than relics. They were proof that no fortress could outlast the will to move forward. And as engineers continued to push eastward, bridging rivers and clearing mines, one lesson guided them from Normandy to the Rhine. Walls can be built by men, but so can the means to break them. The war was far from over, but the Atlantic Wall had shown the world that even concrete dreams crumble before human determination. The Atlantic Wall still stands today in fragments. Its bunkers lie half buried in sand. Its gun emplacements stare blankly at the sea they once guarded. Tourists walk through them now where engineers once crawled under fire. Concrete that was poured to last 1,000 years has cracked under the weight of time and tide. But its story endures, not as a monument to German strength, but as a testament to Allied resolve. The wall was more than stone and steel. It was an idea that fear, discipline, and fortification could stop freedom from advancing. In June 1944, that idea died. For the U.S. engineers who fought their way across Normandy, the victory was not just tactical, it was philosophical. They had proven that invention and courage could shatter anything built on tyranny. Every charge they placed, every road they cleared, every bridge they raised became part of a larger truth. That walls are temporary, but will is permanent. When the beaches fell silent, and the machinery of war gave way to the slow rebuilding of peace, the engineers faded back into the background. Their work had no headlines, no glory. But in every liberated town, in every rebuilt bridge, their legacy remained. A quiet triumph of ingenuity over intimidation. The Atlantic Wall was meant to keep America out of Europe. Instead, it became the road that led her in.